So maybe you could just introduce yourself.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah, cool. So my name is Jonathan Sriranganathan. I'm the Greens candidate for Mayor of Brisbane. For 7 years, I worked as a city councillor with Brisbane City Council. I studied law and arts at University of Queensland, grew up in Northside suburbia. So yeah, born in Brizzy, grew up in West Chermside and spent the first 20 years of my life out that way. And then I kind of moved into the inner city because I was really interested in music and arts and that kind of urban culture. But these days I live on a houseboat in East Brisbane with my partner, Anna.
Yeah, I was the Afterglow.
Yeah.
I saw
Good
that.
research.
Yeah. No, well, it was on one of your other podcasts, but I just thought it looks amazing.
Yeah, it's a beautiful little place to live. It's like very compact. We're talking like 15 square meter cabin. And so not much space at all. Gets a bit hot when it's in the direct sun. And we have to keep all the windows closed in summer to keep out the midges, which is super uncomfortable. And we're living off rainwater, so you have to be really careful with water use, and it's compost toilet. So that has its own complications. But yeah, like it's cool. It's beautiful. It's probably not like a long-term home. We've been on there for 7 years, and I don't know, like at some stage we might like to have a kid or something. So it'd be nice to have a bit more space, but yeah.
How do you go with because you're not on the Brisbane River, are you? Just off on that East Brisbane?
We've moved around a bit, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I've been deliberately a bit circumspect about exactly where we mostly moor because I am a public figure, and I've noticed that people do, like we have had attempts of people to, try and make life difficult for me in one way or another. So yeah, usually we're up one creek or another just because it's a bit safer than the main river in terms of currents and wind and stuff. But
I was wondering about the floods was the question I was kind of
so in the floods
towards.
we were up one of the creeks and we were tied on to like a bunch of mooring posts and old trees and stuff. And we it more or less held in place. But when in 2022, when the creek was really roaring, the boat was swinging out into the current and then swinging back into the trees and then swinging out again. So we didn't stay on it for that night, and we came back in the morning and like everywhere around us is flooded. The whole neighborhood's underwater and our boat is just sort of floating. So it was a weird moment because we still had power because we're on solar and the rest of the neighborhood was out of, So yeah, it's definitely an interesting way of living, and it's been really cool to, I guess, be a bit more in touch with nature and to experiment with living more sustainably and a more compact life. But yeah, I think when we moved on, we thought we'd be there for about 5 years, and now it's been about 7. And if housing was cheaper, we probably would have moved by now.
My question was going to be around, talking with Simon before, the councillors and politicians we have around, regardless of what people think about your politics, you can't deny your commitment. You can't deny your passion. You can't deny that you're up and about and getting involved. Where does that come from? Why do you feel so passionately? How come this is not just a job for you? I don't think it doesn't look like it, It looks like you live and breathe it.
For me, and right now, like I've been campaigning for sort of almost 6 months without getting paid. Like I'm definitely not doing it to make money. I think I do it partly out of a sense of desperation and fear regarding what's going to happen if we don't make some big changes to the current system. So like
That's climate change.
Yeah, really worried about global warming, really worried about the housing crisis and sort of broader economic imbalances. And yeah, I guess I partly that it's fear, and then partly it's hope, right? It's hope that positive change is possible. It's that belief that actually things could be different, and it's the knowledge that in other parts of the world or at other moments in human history, things have been different. So I guess I'm driven by that sense that deep change is necessary, and maybe that comes from a really strong sense of justice and feeling like I often feel like if I witness injustice, it's very hard for me not to want to get involved in some way. And maybe, I don't know where that comes from exactly. Like we grew up in a fairly Christian household, went to Sunday school every week, and maybe that partly shaped my values. And then partly,
Is anyone in the family activist or I guess,
Yeah. So we were in like the Methodist and then the Uniting Church congregation, and those congregations have always had a stronger social justice thread. I don't think my parents would describe themselves as activists. I had one uncle who was a church minister, and he was arrested for protesting for the right to free speech in the Bjelke-Petersen era. So there were these really harsh crackdowns on the right to assemble, and he and a couple of church ministers, I think they were praying in public or something like that and got arrested. Yeah, no, not a like overtly activist political family in that sense. But I guess probably just shaped by the community around me.
How did you find the activism then around, I'm just thinking with that free speech, and I don't want to get into subjects that are kind of too charged. But I mean, I think to the COVID thing with this, you know, because I felt that during that time we went down similar paths. What was your viewpoint on that? Did you notice that?
I was, and right from the outset, I was very critical of the fact that the government was really cracking down on human rights in ways that perhaps were a bit unbalanced or not proportionate to the risks. And there were so many weird moments. Like I was helping organise some refugee rights protests in 2020, and there were these government directives that said no more than 20 people could gather on a street for a protest. But at the same time, they'd allowed people to start going back to the Gabba for games, and their justification was, well, at the Gabba, we've got everyone spaced and we'll have them masked up and stuff. But it was sort of this double standard. And you were like, okay, so you're fine for 10,000 people to go to the Gabba, but you don't want 20 people protesting about refugees. And we saw a lot of those double standards where like local live music venues were shut down, but the casino was still allowed to operate.
Double standards was COVID. For me, double standards is just double standard. There were so many things that were just like that.
And really that's what was happening there was the government was making decisions to prioritize, I would argue, the profits of a few well-connected industries and big businesses and kind of making individuals deal with the fallout. So lots of individuals were struggling, jobs were getting lost, all that sort of thing. And so the costs of responding to the pandemic fell largely on ordinary people, but the accommodations and the exceptions we made primarily benefited big business. And we saw lots of companies made record profits during those periods, but ordinary people ended up in often worse financial positions.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that COVID era just unbelievable.
Yeah, but
I think it's a lot of it's now we look at it, and this is the thing with all the, you know, you'll probably find the same thing with your uncle is now he's vindicated and now it's like you were in the right, but always at the time we can't seem to get it right at the time we need to get it right.
Yeah, but I agree with that, but I do also think we need to be careful of exceptionalizing COVID because, you know, so like one thing that people were really critical of during the the height of the pandemic was like, oh, the government's controlling how we can move around and there was all this fear about vaccine passports and stuff. And I was sitting there like, you know, the government already controls how you move around. Like because you're Australian, your visa, you find it easier to get visas and white Australians can move around most of the world fairly easily. But for most people in the world, we already have really strict border controls. Sure. And if you've got a passport from like a less wealthy African nation or a Middle Eastern country, your movement is already restricted. So there were these sort of narratives of like, this is a completely new thing. They're limited in how people move around overseas this is a new thing like that. And I was like, well, some of this is already happening to a lot of people in the world. Yeah. And now a lot of Australians are like, oh, this has never happened before. It's like, it's never happened to you particularly, but you've benefited from economic and social systems where this has been happening for a long time.
Sure. Do you feel that was a good, like, do you feel there's a bit of a benefit in that then in the sense that people got to see what other people...
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there were more people were politicised during that time and maybe a few more people started asking deeper questions about systemic injustice. I wonder if the conclusions they reached are like...
the right ones.
Yeah, because like I said, people were really like, this is an attack on individual rights and they didn't really have that broader systemic critique of multinational corporations and how big business manipulates government. Sure. It was more just like... that politician is bad. Everyone was like really focused on, say, Dan Andrews. He's done bad things. I was like, this isn't about one individual. This is about broader systems that have been operating in certain ways for a long, long time. And now you're finally noticing that. But don't pretend that that's just one politician doing that. That's a whole infrastructure of control and state surveillance that's been built in for decades.
Yeah. And I guess, look, so there we get onto an interesting point because you talk about state control and I guess government intervention. And when we start talking about things which I know are really important to you now with this current housing crisis, I've got some feedback from people that have, when I've asked people about, like I'm talking to Jonno from the Greens and they say, well, ask him this. Yeah. Government control of housing. So where does that line work in your mind? Because obviously we're talking about rent caps and well, tell us a bit about your solutions for government housing and then I'll come back with what I'm hearing out there about the opposition to that.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, for anyone who's listening, I guess I'd start by emphasising that a lot of things you've probably heard about the Greens haven't come from Greens reps themselves. They've come from other people who are saying this is what the Greens stand for. So it's like, fair enough. It's good to be skeptical of those information sources. The first point I'd make is that right now in Australia, housing is very, very heavily regulated and is definitely the subject of extensive government control. And it's been like that right since the invasion, right? The government has always been responsible for deciding where land can be developed and for parceling up land and handing it out to some people and not handing it out to others. And that's continued right through for the past 200 years. And in the modern era, governments are very, very prescriptive about what you can build where, but they're also very prescriptive in terms of shaping a tax system that encourages property investment. So right now you have like a lot of tax levers in terms of capital gains tax discounts, et cetera, that encourage people to invest more in real estate than they would in, say, a small business or a startup. So there are all these existing government interventions that are pumping more money into real estate and away from other more productive sectors of the economy. So we need to start by recognizing that we are a long, long way from what people might call a free market in terms of housing. We are in a highly regulated, extremely interventionist housing policy landscape. And
does that include the rates, the RBA rates? Is that part of the lever that they pull?
I guess so, right? Like the RBA is a creation of the government and sort of shapes interest rates and stuff. But I guess I'm just talking at a macro level. These things are already the very heavy subject of government control. So yeah, the Greens are talking about some regulatory interventions. In a way, you could argue we're also arguing for the government to get less involved in housing in some ways. So we want to scrap capital gains tax discounts and negative gearing because those are government interventions that distort where people invest their money. So yeah, we are talking about temporary freezes on rent increases, and at the local council level, we've been talking about a vacancy levy on empty homes. But these are fairly minor interventions compared to the stuff that government is already doing, and some of that stuff are things that the Greens are wanting to wind back. But I guess there's this sort of key question around public housing. How much housing should be built by government? How much housing should be built by the private sector? And what we've seen in Australia over the last couple of decades is a massive drop in the proportion of government-owned housing or non-profit housing. So historically, Australia built proportionally more public housing, and there was also more non-profit community housing. So that was stuff that maybe not owned by government directly, but by some other non-profit community org. Yeah. And we've lost a lot of that. Like there used to be housing cooperatives where a bunch of hippies would get together and they'd buy a block of land and they'd develop it and they'd sort of just pass it on to other people within the network. And so there are all these other different models of housing ownership and management that we've sort of pushed out of the ecosystem, and we've been left with a lot of for-profit private development and then a tiny sliver of government public housing. And so for me, I think we need to broaden and diversify the range of housing tenure options and ownership structures. But my starting point is recognizing that if you leave it up to the private sector and the majority of housing is being supplied by people who need to make a profit, then there's always an incentive for those people to have rents and house prices rising. Because if you're a property developer or a real estate agent, your bottom line is connected to the fact that house prices are rising or that rents are rising. It is against your own self-interest in the commercial short-term sense for house prices to fall. So if you've got an entire housing system where all the people or the vast majority of people who are responsible for delivering housing also want house prices to continue rising, then of course you're going to have people becoming homeless and getting priced out. So we need some government public housing and some level of government regulation and intervention to counterbalance that. And that's kind of where I'm coming at it from.
Yeah. And does that look like, I guess that's where I think people get afraid with the balancing side of it, because statistically speaking, if we look at government housing, how much has it dropped off? Like, where are we at compared to where we should have been? Because that's something I haven't really looked at myself.
I believe we're about 3% of housing stock in Australia is government-owned housing, and that's very, very small. Like somewhere like Vienna, I think it's like 40%.
Right.
So Vienna built a lot of social housing back in like the 1920s before Hitler invaded, and even since then they've continued to maintain this sort of idea of public housing as something that's not just for the very poor and the most vulnerable, but public housing is something that lots of middle-class people live in too. And so, you know, right now it's kind of a choice like, do you want private investors to be collecting rent and making a profit from housing, or does the government own some housing and it collects rent and it's using that to maintain the stock and repair the stock and that sort of stuff? So I think
know people are going to argue that incentivizing the other side of the coin will then incentivize like less productivity and more, like less, and maybe even devalue housing or create slums, for lack of a better word, or create gluts. It's one of those things. Like, we've got Housing Commission in Melbourne. I'm not sure really where it is because I'm relatively new to Brisbane. But, you do have these sort of parts of the city that become shitholes, and I guess that would be where people's fear comes from. You're going, well, how do you have a beautiful home and then the people next to you are, I guess, public housing, and making sure that we've got, I guess, a social standing. It's all taboo to talk about, but this is what people are worried about.
I think so. I think that a few things to say. One is that we know that concentrating all the public housing in like one precinct can exacerbate or amplify disadvantage. And so the Greens are definitely arguing for spreading public housing around, right? Like, put more public housing in the wealthiest suburbs and put more public housing in a dispersed neighborhood rather than all in one big tower together. But we also have to be careful of some of these stigmas and stereotypes, because there are lots of very sensible people who live in public housing. They've got their act together. They're not on drugs or anything like that, but you don't hear those stories, and it's very easy to demonize. You hear that, public housing horror story, and that's what everyone focuses on.
This is the marketing
exactly.
You've got to handle, because but what we would all say we're non-judgmental, but we are going to have, everyone's going to feel that way. And that's what you're saying there. Even if you're building this sort of, I guess, the best idea of it and the best array of balance, I think we then still end up with a situation where, why does someone get that beautiful home and I have to work for it?
I know what you mean.
I have to pay for it,
And
playing devil's advocate.
And it's just good to remember as well that because of that decrease in the overall supply of public housing stock, or that decrease in the proportion, right now the government is really only housing people in public housing with very high needs, severe, chronic illnesses or dependencies. So whereas, say, like I said, in Vienna, public housing is just like lots of middle class people with jobs, etc. In Brisbane, really only people with severe drug dependencies or severe health issues or disabilities or mental health issues, those are really the only people now who are getting public housing, because there's such a shortage. So if we increase the overall supply of public housing, then we have a situation where it's not just people who have really complex needs and need a lot of support who are being put into public housing. It's sort of more general population. And at the same time, what we need is that those people who do have drug addiction issues or mental health issues, those people should be in supported accommodation. They shouldn't just be in general residential housing where they're kind of left to fend for themselves. Like, if someone's got those chronic illnesses or mental health conditions, then they need to be getting support. And I think that's also, it's understandable that there's stigma around public housing, because you're putting all these people with really high needs into one place and then just leaving them. And that's obviously a recipe for problems. So I'm definitely not defending the current approach to public housing management, but I do think it's just kind of naive to think that the property sector or the property industry is going to house people on very low incomes.
Right.
They're not. That's not worth money to them, right?
It's a for-profit
model, so
right?
if their motivation is we want to maximize profits, then one way or another, they're not going to be housing these most vulnerable members of our community. So we do need public housing.
Okay. Which brings me to and this is, I guess, another question from a friend of mine I spoke to about when I told him I was talking to you was, he's a landlord, right? And what he worries about with the Greens is he's got an investment property, and he feels that as a landlord, the Greens demonise him because he's had a situation where his tenants haven't paid the rent and he's had to evict, and it's gone back and forth. This is actually in Victoria. It's gone back and forth with VCAT. He's ended up nearly in a marriage breakdown himself because he has a mortgage. He's not some big fat guy in a suit with a tycoon. Exactly. And he said exactly that word. He didn't use tycoon. I can't remember the word he used, but he doesn't have a pocket watch hanging out. And
I get you. Yeah.
And he feels that you guys are supporting this idea that when the tenant doesn't pay the rent, that they can't get evicted. And I've seen some of your podcasts, and I would say it is controversial because that there is something that, as you've mentioned, that we shouldn't be doing. Making the property for profit and turning it into a commodity that we basically use to fund our retirement. And, I heard you say that it's not self-funded because it's funded by the tenant. I understand that. Yeah. I could argue that nothing's really self-funded because, even if you have a small business, technically the customers are funding that. But I hear what you're saying, and it would be a nice idea. And I think working towards it is a good idea. Right now, though, it doesn't sit that way. So when you've got a guy who does have his retirement plan tied up in a couple of investment properties, or and he's hoping that rent comes in so he can pay his mortgage, which has just gone up from 2% to 6%, and he's under a lot of stress. And then now we've got the tenant not paying. He can't evict them.
I get what you mean.
So how do you talk to this guy? What do you say to that?
And to be honest, like I'm here saying the whole system needs to change. And so when you look at one or two isolated Greens policies by themselves, you're like, well, that's not going to work because of this and this and this. But like, we're not just talking about changing this one thing. We're talking about major changes to a whole bunch of policy areas. And so like, say with this guy, we've got generations of people who've been told by government for years, invest your money in housing. That's how you build wealth for retirement. What the Greens want to do is make sure that the pension is livable and that people can actually have a high quality retirement just on the pension. And so like when I say, hey, we want to discourage people from investing in private real estate to make money, we're also saying we want a better social support network so that retirees can be like live a good life without having to worry about where money's going to come from. So, I mean, for this guy, like the honest answer is that we shouldn't be in a situation where one person being able to pay for their costs or whatever, and he wants whatever his bills are, is coming at the expense of another person's welfare. Like we've created a divisive system, and sometimes I'm accused of being divisive, but I'm like pointing out divisions that are already there in society. And I think the challenge... But
division, right? Like just to interrupt on that point, because the reason you're here talking to me is exactly what we're trying to do, because I think we all see the same problems. Honestly, like I think a lot of the problems that we talk about, if you talk to people about climate change, okay, they'll argue about, some people will say it's overblown and this and that, but generally speaking, most people will agree that the world is in a bad shape. They'll argue whether it's China causing it, and they'll argue whether we should do more or this or that, but it's the solutions that we actually get the division over, not necessarily the problem. So I look at what you're saying and I say, yeah, I agree. I agree. There is some issues, and I can't, and having dealt in finance for a long time and met thousands and thousands of people over my career, I don't even like, I have heaps of problems with the actual model. Like I said, I'm a frustrated artist, but I have to live, and I have goals, I have kids, I have things I need to do, and I've got to make money somehow, and I don't want to retire broke. So this option's here, and I'm in this position. This guy's in this position. So he's
well, I mean, the starting point, right, is that housing should be treated as a basic human right. And right now, a lot of people have been told to treat it as a commodity to make money, and been encouraged to treat it as a commodity to make money. But if you are making money from supplying or controlling access to a basic human right, you do have a duty of care to your tenant, and you do have, like, that tenant is helping you pay off your mortgage, and so like, sorry, but we shouldn't really be evicting people into homelessness. And maybe the best outcome in this situation would be for the government to come in and buy that dwelling off this investor and say, look, this tenant's about to become homeless. We're willing to turn this into public housing. Will you sell it to us? We'll buy it at market rates. He gets out of the picture. He no longer has to worry about the tenant and whether they're paying rent. The tenant stays housed with, like that's probably the best case scenario.
And I can hear the opposition to what you're saying, saying, but he didn't break the agreement. You know what I mean? Like, and I understand that.
But let's wind it back a bit, right? Like, we are in a crisis that I've not seen in my lifetime. We're not just talking about a few people here and there becoming homeless. We are talking about mass homelessness. Rents are still rising. An entire generation of even people like law degree, middle class. I still can't afford to buy my own home. Forget about people on the lower end of the economic pyramid. So I'm starting from the perspective of saying, you need to explain to me why the current system is legitimate or why it's working. Like, I'm here saying, look, here's an alternative system, but it almost sounds like this question presumes that the current system is working okay. And I don't think you think it is working okay, but like the responsibility is not on me to say, oh, hey, this alternative, like, I want people to explain why the hell do you think the current system is good? Because it's making people homeless. It's also not yielding very good environmental outcomes. We're not even building that much new housing. So the current system of leaving things up to the private industry is failing catastrophically. So I think we need to start that conversation about, like, rather than focusing, I get it, like from a political perspective, that guy wants an answer to this individual problem. And I'm saying there are structural problems here. This is deep and systemic, and we need to transform that entire housing and development system and then talk about solutions from that end rather than saying, oh, well, this feels unfair in this one-on-one situation. Because I also think it's unfair that one person gets to buy multiple homes while someone else can't buy any. Like, that's a problem too.
All right, well, let's move on then to homelessness, because you kind of got into that a little bit there as well. So what is behind this homeless crisis? What do we do about it? I mean, I'm seeing, even on my morning run now, I'm seeing people under the bridge and stuff, and out at West End, we've got the camps happening, and I've seen what's happening in the States. Are we heading down that direction? Is there a solution? This is something that a lot of people are noticing, and it's becoming, I think it does actually make a city unsafe. So when you've got councillors, and we'll talk about some of the things that we do talk about with councillors, which is mainly bike paths and green space. I think the main thing people are worried about is more so these types of issues. So tell us what your thoughts are on the homeless crisis, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, homelessness is a symptom of a broader failure in the housing system where we are treating housing as a way to make money rather than as a basic human right and a necessity to house people. And like I said earlier, if you have a system that's predominantly structured around making profit, then really in order for housing to be profitable, there has to be some people who are locked out of the housing market. Like if everyone who needed a home had a home, and everyone had a good quality home that they were happy with, and there was like a surplus of homes, then house prices would be falling, rents would be falling. So to be blunt, property developers, real estate agents, property speculators, investors who make money off housing, they actually need people to be homeless. Because if no one was homeless, there wouldn't be excess demand for their stock and their profit margins would be collapsing. So rather than seeing homelessness as like this weird aberration, it's actually essential to the way the current housing system works. We've created a housing system that depends on a certain proportion of people being homeless. Do you know what I mean?
I do, but I'm trying to see it broadly in the sense that, okay, let's say we built, 20,000 homes tomorrow and staggered them around the place and housed everyone. I don't know if, you can tell me I'm wrong. I'm here to learn. Sure. Right? Yeah. So just so we're clear, right? Would actually, like, a lot of these people aren't at the level to, I'm going to sound, I guess, bigoted here, but I mean, I look at the guy who's struggling with, whether it be a mental illness or a drug situation or some sort of emotional trauma, and my heart goes out to the guy. I don't want to come across as heartless, but I feel like if I gave that person a house, I don't know whether we're at that level. I feel like there's a lot of steps and there's a lot of
and I mean that guy's
assistance
and that guy's capacity and mental health is probably a lot worse since he's gone onto the street. Like I've seen this, right? Like say casual retail worker who's a little bit disorganized, maybe isn't the smartest at managing their finances, but ends up in a situation where they get evicted because the rent goes out, and then they're sleeping in their car, and then their car breaks down, and then they're sleeping in a tent. By the time you see them on the street, they've been on this long downward spiral where their mental health has gotten worse, they're not getting enough sleep, their resilience, their decision-making, all that is collapsed. So sure, that person at that moment is going to really struggle to integrate back into standard housing. And that's why the Greens argue for supported accommodation where you've got wraparound services. Because we have seen situations where people who are like sleeping rough on the street long term, they get housed, they don't know how to organise to pay the bills, they don't know how to clean, whatever. But I should also emphasise that a lot of people who are homeless or in precarious housing right now, they are not high needs. They're not people whose life has completely fallen apart. Like I see people who work in construction or who work in retail who are also homeless. They're holding down a job, a full-time job sometimes, and they still can't find an affordable rental. So, I mean, housing those people, definitely, they're ready for a home. They just want it to be, I guess, available. But the challenge, and this is the question I have maybe for people who are advocates of the current system or like, don't change anything, things are working fine right now. Like the narrative seems to be, or this is how it's been put to me, if we build more and more homes, eventually rents will start falling and people will be able to get back into the housing market. That's kind of the argument, right?
Well,
the supply and demand
works,
but what happens is in practice is that let's say we build so many more homes, that rents start to fall and property prices start to fall, are developers going to keep building even if property prices and rents are falling? Like, do you think they will?
I guess so.
Okay, so they keep building and then rents and property prices fall, but construction costs are still high. So the price that you can sell your new stock is now a lot lower.
Right. Yeah.
Your construction costs are still high. Are they still going to keep building?
No.
So this is the problem, right? This like supply and demand logic assumes that developers are going to keep building even as profit margins diminish. And I think that's nonsense. I think that in practice, this idea that we can just build our way, we can rely on the private sector to build our way out of the housing crisis is subject to this fundamental contradiction, because we're expecting that profit-motivated developers will keep building even when it stops being profitable to do so. That's ludicrous.
Well, I'll push back a little bit, because I did a calculation, and I don't want to, it was somewhere here, I did a quick calculation, right?
Sure.
So, and this is not to, I was just thinking about this argument about how the property developers, et cetera. But basically, I've done a calculation here, which I'll put on the screen or whatever, if you want to have a quick look.
Sure.
Basically, let me just talk it through for people who are listening. I've just said, and these, I'm not a property developer, but I'm roughly guessing that if we've got a property, if you buy a property for $1 million and you want to put 4 townhouses on it, I've had a quick look, and out of this development sort of scenario here, there's about 500 grand in government, what the government gets out of that project, and the developer gets about 150 grand after all these taxes. What are the government expenses? Well, the government's getting stamp duty, the government's getting GST, the government's getting rates, the government's getting a whole bunch of stuff. Again, someone's going to look at that, and if I'll put it online, and they'll go, that's 20 grand more, this is 50 grand more. But that's just me Googling how to develop a property.
Your main point is that profit margins are not huge.
Well, my main point is also that if the government want to help them out, they could possibly charge them less or reduce. There's other ways they could build profit into properties. Maybe they could reduce some of their costs, the bureaucracy, the red tape. Yeah, there's guys building in Paddington at the moment, and I know of a house, for example, that now there's a new law about having to put a disabled toilet on the ground floor. So you've got these kind of ridiculous.
I don't think that's a law for basic houses. This must be like room in accommodation or something.
No, it was. I'll double check that because I don't want to misquote. But it was adding about 100 grand to the build costs, and then you've got 5-star energy ratings and all this. And I know we need to do it, but the costs of all this stuff, I think that it's not just that silver bullet sort of situation either. I think there's a lot of areas.
I'm not arguing for silver bullets. I'm arguing that we need to change this and this and this and this and this, and the whole thing is broken. Like I'm saying, the entire housing and development and planning system is completely messed up, and we've got to transform the whole thing. But yeah, you're right. Like for some property developers in some sectors of the market, it is completely unprofitable now to build the kind of housing we need, which is why I'm arguing for public housing and to stop relying on property developers to deliver this stuff, because they can't profitably deliver housing without ripping someone off. Right. Like they might like to, maybe they want to be able to do that. But what's interesting though about your example there is that one of the major components in, say, a build cost is the cost of land. And the reality is that land values are partly a function of development potential and sort of anticipated future yields from sales and stuff.
What you can get out of it going forward,
So, right, in a context where everyone is expecting the market to continue growing and developers are expecting like prices to continue rising, and at the same time, the development industry is lobbying the council and saying, hey, rezone all these blocks of land to allow higher density development. All of that's putting upward pressure on land values. So there's this perverse situation happening at the moment, and I'll describe it briefly, and I'm probably going to run out of time on this, but like a developer buys a cheap block of land, like an old warehouse or whatever, and they buy it fairly cheaply because maybe it's flood prone or it's not near public transport. And they say to the council, hey, rezone this so that we can build housing there. And the council rezones it. And before the developer has built anything, that land value, and they're not even a developer, they're just a speculator, right? They benefit from this uplift. Then the developer's got a choice. Do I go ahead and develop this now? I mean, it's been rezoned, I can put houses there now, or do I wait? And so they could spend a lot of money now developing, and maybe they can build to 3 stories, or they can sit and wait and they can keep pressuring the council, and maybe in a few years' time, the council is going to rezone it for 10 stories. So there's this financial, every year you get to this choice. You're like, do I build now or or do I delay and develop later? And they keep making that choice of delaying and developing later. And the whole time that's putting upward pressure on land values. They're actively lobbying councils to rezone. Now, what the Greens are arguing for is a series of policy interventions like vacancy levies that would actually put downward pressure on land values. So when you take all the different Greens policies together, sure, there might be like a slight limitation on how much, if there's going to be a 2-year rent freeze and we're only talking about a temporary thing, but or there might be increased costs because we're requiring developers to include more green space in their new developments. But at the same time, we're putting significant downward pressure on land values. So even if building standards are really high and like some developers complain that we're forcing them to put windows in every bedroom, which is a Greens policy, there's at the same time that's going to be reflected by a drop in land values because land values are a response to developer demand. And if you can't get as much yield or profit out of the site, then over time demand for land is going to drop. What's weird at the moment is that even as construction costs have risen, land values haven't fallen in proportion because developers are still lobbying for relaxations to allow them to squeeze more yield onto a site. If the council came out tomorrow and said, look, we're not going to rezone any more of these sites for the next 5 years, then land values would start to stabilise and probably even drop. And developers would be like, okay, well, there's no point me waiting. I might as well build now because it's still going to be zoned for 5 stories into the future. So, this we could talk about this all day.
I know,
so,
but it's great. Look, I think I think you've at least presented and spoken about the things that we wanted to speak about. With time, I guess, I'm not sure how you're going. Do you have to be somewhere?
Yeah, I've got to get, okay. But we'll
just wrap it up. The last thing I guess we'll just hit on is probably, there's a couple of divisive areas I want to talk about. How do we resolve, just me and you right now, let's fix it. How do we resolve the, I guess let's just call it the Australia Day, Invasion Day debate. Where are we at with this as a country? How do we move along? Like, let's just put parties aside. And
we don't have time for this conversation. Like, it's such a big issue. And I think when we're just like, it's Australia Day versus Invasion Day, people protest, blah, like that's really a symptom of a much deeper problem at the heart of the Australian nation state. And this is something that a lot of people they'd prefer to just ignore it or tell them, sing themselves lullabies or whatever, because it's easier than confronting the hard truth that there was an invasion that happened, people were murdered, people had their land stolen from them, and then over multiple generations, we've continued to oppress those people and prevent them enjoying the kind of life that the rest of us enjoy. And so when people are protesting on Invasion Day, it's not really just about the date, and it's not really a debate about what date should we celebrate on. It's people are protesting about these broader structural injustices. There are still Aboriginal people up north who are saying, this is my land. My family have been living here for 40,000 years. I don't want you to mine it. And then you've got non-Indigenous people coming in saying, we're going to dig up your country. And they're like, well, no, that's my land. You can't just come in and do that. So
let's just, because I know time's an issue, but what would it look like in an ideal scene? What would it look like? That's what I think what I try to get to is,
what's the utopia?
Yeah, what's the utopia from your perspective? Because it's probably not going to be everyone's.
No, sure.
But what would you like to see ultimately? Would we scrap the Australia Day? Would we not have? How do we bring the country together? How do we bring the country together? And what are the groups that we need to kind of make compensation or help or hurt?
I think this is
in a nutshell.
It's
a massive
there's
one.
no way to simplify such a big and complex and interesting topic, right? But we have to start by recognizing that there are past wrongs and continuing injustices that need to be rectified. And so if we're all over here focusing on people are protesting on Australia Day and I feel uncomfortable about that, how do we fix that? We've got to talk about all this big stuff over here first. And I don't think it's my place as an individual to be this is how the world should work. I don't want to be prescriptive and saying, here's my top-down vision for how I would reorganize all of society. But I think fundamentally a big problem with society right now is centralized government control. And I think sometimes people get into this false binary where they think it's either big government control or big corporations have freedom to do whatever the hell they want. And those aren't the only two options. So I'm arguing for a world where more decisions are made at the local level, where control is decentralized, not to individuals, but to communities, where families and extended community groups work out amongst themselves how land will be used, what will happen in certain spaces. And those sorts of structures, what we might call decentralized, almost anarchic, and I use that in the political sense, not in like as a synonym for chaos, but the old anarchist theorists who would be arguing like, we don't need top-down government controlling and delivering everything. We can have communities providing for themselves, trading with other communities or interacting with other communities in a way that's free of big government interference, but also free of big corporations that are taking land, taking resources, enclosing value, and stealing from people, which is really how corporate profits work. So my utopia is kind of a smaller role for the nation state, a bigger role for local autonomous communities to serve their own needs. And once you start decentralizing and localizing power in that way, it becomes a lot easier for people to say, oh, we're now farming on this land and this is where we all live, and this used to be like your family's land for tens and thousands of years. How can we negotiate on a human-to-human basis and start like over generations repairing those injustices? Because there's no way that the Australian government is going to be able to negotiate with the 300 different or 400 different Aboriginal nations that we've stolen land from. Like that's a messy negotiation, right?
Yeah.
So if we're trying to talk about how do we rectify for the theft of land and the theft of children and the slave labor, like that's got to happen on a more human-to-human level rather than, because I think people forget, right? Like right up until the 60s and 70s, there were Aboriginal people who were working unpaid. Like a lot of the public infrastructure, even like some of Queensland's railroads, were effectively built by Aboriginal slave labor. And that's in like, within 100 years ago. So this is not like ancient history. This is people who are still alive today who had their wages stolen by the Queensland government or the Australian government. So I think it's so tempting to want to be like, what's the quick fix? How can we get this sorted and then move on with the rest of progress? But this is foundational stuff. And the hard truth is that it's not going to go away easily, and it's not going to be easily fixed by like waving a magic wand. And I think some people are in denial about that. They're really naive and idealistic, and they think that if we can just keep pushing in this direction and ignore that stuff, magically it's going to get better.
Well, I think what it comes down to is there seems to be like, is that the Australian history is black t-shirt?
White Australia has a black history.
Has a black history, yeah, cool. And I think we as humans want to fix something, and I think a lot of people, if you go out there and ask, and I'd say I'm included in this, it's almost like I think that the white Australian generally feels that they are wanting to fix it maybe and not sure how to.
People have good intentions.
Exactly. And I just feel like a perpetuated upset doesn't really help anyone. So I think when I talk to some of the friends that I've had that are Indigenous, and I admittedly don't have too many, but the input I get is varied, and it seems like there's, like you say, there's no quick fix. Yeah. But I guess everyone wants to know if there is a fix, and can we just kind of work towards? And I think as it becomes a political device to win votes, lose votes, that's where we get a real issue, because political parties tend to use it. Yeah,
and this is a really crude example, but let's say like your dad had a nice old car and my dad stole it off him, and now I've got that car. And now I've got that car. Like, are you happy for me to keep that car, or do you think I should give it back to you? Like, that's a genuine question. If like my dad stole a car off your dad and then I inherited that car, is that just mine now?
Well,
because particularly if throughout history you kept saying, that's my car, you guys have got my car, give my car back. Should I just get to keep the car?
Definitely not.
Okay.
But I'm playing devil's advocate. Yeah. I just don't think people are going to say that it's the same. You know?
No, they're not. There's a real...
And that's where you're going to get... That's why you won't get a straight answer. And I think, definitely that car situation, obviously there's... And again, I'm not trying to speak for myself. I'm trying to be the guy that's listening to this saying, well, Sean, you should have said that. You should have said that.
Well, I'm interested in what you think. You know? Like, do you think the car should be returned to its original
Absolutely.
owner? Okay.
Yeah. Or at least some sort of agreement. I think agreement is the key.
For what was taken.
Well, I could agree with you that it's not the car's not in the same condition. What is the value of the car? We could actually, as long as we agree, and I think that's the key into any deal.
And that's why people talk about...
both parties need to actually say, I'm happy with this deal.
Yeah, and that's why people talk about treaty negotiations. Yeah. People want to negotiate treaties. And that's why, the voice referendum was a bit of a distraction, and all this Australia Day stuff is a sort of superfluous secondary thing. A lot of Aboriginal people are saying we need treaty making processes, which are agreement making. It's like, look, all this bad stuff's happened. We can't change the past. How are we going to rectify it? Let's sit down and negotiate treaties. But for that negotiation to be meaningful and to result in an outcome that everyone's happy with, there has to be a willingness on the party that stole the car to actually relinquish something. If you go into that negotiating table and say, yeah, I've got your car now, I'm just going to let you drive it once a week.
I'll tell you the major difference, right? The major difference is your dad stole my car, let's say.
Yeah, sure.
Me and you are here.
Yeah.
But if I've got a friend saying that car's worth way more than that, what he wants to give you, don't take that. Don't accept that deal. And this is where what you're saying there, the simplified example of the car, it's just
which I acknowledge is an oversimplification.
Oh, but it's a great one because, and I'm not trying to shit on the example.
Sure.
I'm trying to say, well, the complexity of the situation we've got at the moment is that we have other political interests perpetuating this argument about the car. We have other political interests thinking they can get more than just, and so when you're sending someone to the table to negotiate on your behalf about the car, or in this case the land, or in this case the Aboriginal rights, or the Australia Day, it's like the person that we're going to select, it's like you're selecting two lawyers to represent you, and then other people get involved, and it gets super complicated.
Yeah,
and I think,
but I think what's important to recognize here is that, like, I use a car example, but what we're actually talking about that was stolen was people's very means of existing and subsisting. We took their homes, we took their food supplies, we took everything that they had that they depended on for the life they wanted to live. And so, like, then for a couple of decades, now a couple of centuries, we gave them crumbs, and then, like, we locked them up when they complained about it or tried to steal a bit more back. This is a big injustice that's not going to be rectified without some hard negotiating. And you're right, there are different political actors who are trying to emphasize division, maybe for their own political gain. But actually, I think what's really going on is that people understand that this is a really big and deep issue for Australian society, and that we're going to have some hard conversations about it. And I think everyone's just kind of in denial about it. Like,
when you say hard conversations, and this is the thing, it's still not something I can grab.
Yeah.
So what is a hard conversation? Are we talking about paying back a lot of money? Are we talking about...
Yeah, well, see, part of the problem, right, is that Aboriginal, and I don't want to speak for Aboriginal people, but like Aboriginal conceptions of land ownership are different, right? Like, it's not like, oh, I'm just going to give a whole bunch of money or compensation or whatever to one Aboriginal guy. Like, that people are calling for a transfer of land ownership, this demand for land back. They're saying, we want some of our land back, not to us as individuals, but into communal ownership. So that forces...
Is that the Aboriginal Land Council?
I don't think people are saying that land council system is a particularly good one, right? Because often land councils are representing a bunch of different Aboriginal nations. So it's like having one land council to sell. Sure. Yeah, that doesn't really work very well. But yeah, people are saying we want some of our land back. They're not saying we want it all. They're not saying that they want to drive non-Indigenous people like you and me back into the ocean or whatever. But they're saying that we took everything and we should be giving some of it back at least. Or if not that, giving people the means to subsist. Because honestly, it's kind of weird, right? How many Aboriginal people are homeless in their own land? That is a failed system where people who had housing, who had land, now don't. And it's not their own fault that was taken off them. That was us or our ancestors. And so, we have to, you're asking, what is the one thing we can do? Well, and people are saying the one thing you can do is give our land back. And if we don't want to do that, because they're saying this is what we want our land back. If we don't want to do that, then it's up to us to work out what else we're willing to offer and put on the table in that negotiation. So they've got their negotiation position. Their negotiation position is give us back some of what you stole. We as non-Indigenous people have to decide, well, what are we willing to give up in order to make this right? That's a hard question, but that's for us to answer. It's not for them to answer.
Yeah, and I could probably delve deeper into this, but I guess, like you say, it's not for us to really speak on. My only concern is really that we end up with it's still a divided country, and that's what I'm worried about. I guess is that we still have this. I'm looking for a way to I guess my ultimate goal is for everyone to kind of get along. Yeah. Sounds kind of utopian, but
and I think it's going to be hard for people to get along when one party stole literally everything that the other party had. Like, if you want everyone to get along, you've got to rectify that injustice.
But even if we gave it back, or
gave some of it back,
and there was money, and there was at the end of it, then like okay, take welcome to country. So then, are we still at the point where we have?
Look, I think that's a symbolic. That's a small thing, right?
Sure,
like,
sure.
It's a symbolic gesture.
But it might be symbolic, and it might. But there's a lot of people who you know how according to The Voice, I'd say half the country's against it, half the country's for it. So whatever. The point is that. At some point, do we get Australia back to being Australia, or is it always going to have this undercurrent of divide? You know, that's the question I think I'm searching for.
Because like Australia was a racist colonial project. Like the entire country was founded on genocide, on massacres, on stealing people's land, even on manipulating like working class white people. Right, like the entire project from the outset and conception was pretty messed up. So like to unpack that and chart a way forward towards like a nation state that we can all be proud of and that doesn't replicate injustice is like, that's a very big task.
It's a big ask.
And it was not something that's going to happen in our lifetimes. Like there's been 200 plus years of dispossession. It's going to take a couple generations to rectify all that. But I think we also have to move away from the idea that the nation isn't already divided in lots of other ways, right? Like right now, Australia's economy is very heavily dependent on exploitable migrant labor and on cheaply manufactured goods from overseas. So like we are already a divided nation in that we've got a whole bunch of people on whose work we depend or whose labor we exploit who aren't citizens. Like we take the stuff they make or we benefit from their work, but they don't get a vote in electing the government. So like there are all these other divisions in society that we don't even have time to talk about today. And like, I think if you're trying to imagine a world where, like non-Indigenous Australians and Indigenous Australians are all like one and we can all get along and just be citizens together, you've still got to talk about all these other injustices that are also part of the Australian colonial project. And like, that's not something you can wave a magic wand and fix. And like I said earlier, I think people are just naive about the scale of the problem. They're like idealistic about like, we'll just like sit down and sing Kumbaya and then everything will be fine. It's like, no, man, you stole an entire continent. You can't just fix that with like platitudes. So yeah, I'm sorry to be the bearer of hard truths, but like this is big, real stuff. And like I said, the entire Australian economic system still depends on injustice and underpaid migrant workers and like cheap foreign labor. Like, that is a pretty foundational contradiction. The Australian nation state is not really sovereign in the sense that our economy is so dependent on economies in other parts of the world, which involve a lot of exploitation. So like, yeah, dealing with like the Australian Day debate is just a tiny little piece of that puzzle.
All right. Well, thanks.
Which we have more time to chat
honestly,
about this.
Honestly, I think that no one can deny that, like I said, a quick story is when you got elected to the council the first time round, a friend of mine got a telemarketing style, vote for the Greens call from one of your guys and said, I'm not going to vote for the Greens, and told him his story. And you got on the phone, you wouldn't remember the call, but he spoke to you like for 40 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
And I think what that tells me is that, you're definitely just probably the most passionate out of all the politicians we've got going around at the moment.
Thanks.
Like there's no denying it. People will disagree with you. I'm sure you see it every day, and I'm sure you've got thick skin because you are taking on the fight. And, everyone's got their opinions, and I really appreciate you talking to me, mate.
Yeah, likewise. I appreciate the dialogue.
To close it out, what would you say, I guess, why should people vote for you instead of their other two options, which is Labor and Liberal?
Because
honestly, with Labor and Liberal, from where I sit, they're a bit of a their politics has become a little bit sort of convoluted. I think what I see is with Greens in growing popularity is not necessarily the politics of it; it's more the feet on the ground is what I'm seeing. So tell us what you think, and then we'll let you sort of wrap it up.
So, I mean, I guess first thing is that like people are voting for the Greens for different reasons. And I don't think anyone is going to agree 100% with every single Greens policy. So like, I don't think I even agree with every single Greens policy. I was pretty opposed to the sugar tax idea, for example. But like, So if there's one thing you don't like about the Greens, but you're on board with the rest of our policies, then you should probably still vote for us because you like most of our policies. And I mean, Labor and the Liberals don't have a lot to offer in terms of change. But really, that's the underlying pitch from the Greens is that right now, if you think society is working really, really well and that everything's functioning smoothly and you're not too worried about the future, then keep voting for the two major parties. Because they're saying that they're not going to change very much. They're going to make a few tweaks around the edges, that whether it's on housing or food production or any number of issues, they're basically saying we're going to stay the course and more or less keep doing what we're doing. So if you think things are working well right now, keep voting for them. And some people will, because some people are doing quite well out of the current system and they don't have kids, so they're not worried about future generations. They're like, I'm fine. By all means, keep voting. If you agree we need change, then the Greens are the party of change. And we can make space for more debates about exactly what that kind of change looks like and exactly what the policy settings are. But the Greens' message is stuff needs to change. And I guess the thing that should give people some confidence is that Greens are very strongly committed to grassroots participatory democracy. We get out there and talk to people, but we also want to give people meaningful control. And I practice what I preach on that. Like I had a $500,000 discretionary budget each year for park upgrades. And rather than me making up my own mind and saying the basketball court's going to go there and the pedestrian upgrade can go there, we had a community vote. And we said to people, this is your money. How do you want it to be spent? And people got a vote and they wanted a basketball court in Musgrave Park. So we built that, and they wanted lights at the dog park. So this idea of direct community voting is kind of foundational to the Greens. And that's a big difference between Labor and the Liberals, where you vote once every 3 or 4 years for a politician. And then in between elections, you have no guarantee that they're going to listen to you or do what you want. Whereas the Greens are saying, vote for us, and then we will introduce grassroots participatory democracy processes where ordinary residents get a vote over the things that they care about. So we can have different views about what development should go where, or whether we need more bike lanes, or whether we need more bus routes. Like reasonable people can disagree about where the balance should be struck. But the Greens' message is one of localizing and decentralizing control so that you get a say in what's important rather than it just being the politicians and public servants. And so, yeah, I think that's why people should vote Greens, is that we're a party of change. And right now, a lot of stuff needs to change because homelessness is the worst it's been in lifetimes. The environment is in a really poor state. Our food systems are increasingly precarious and insecure. We are not well prepared for global warming. We are not well prepared for, even a couple 100,000 residents from Cairns and Townsville are going to be moving down to Brisbane in a few years. No one's been planning for that. We're going to have climate refugees from within Queensland that we've got to deal with. So these are big challenges on the near horizon, and the Labor and Liberal parties have got their heads in the sand on this. So we've got to start owning up to this stuff, being honest with ourselves and be like, oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff we need to pay attention to, rather than, hey, there's an Olympics coming up. Everyone look at that. Don't worry about all this other stuff, which is what we're being fed at the moment.
Great. All right. Well, great chat, man.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for coming in.
Cheers, Sean. It's been a pleasure.
And good luck with the election.
Thank you.
See you, bro.